Yes. Yeah, should be. Yeah. Okay, let's get going. All right, so here we are. It's April 18th. We have just a couple more lectures left. The third mini project is due on Wednesday. Right? I hope you've been having some good experiences with that, interesting time. And I hope that your projects are also in good shape. You have a few weeks, but you know, I hope that's all working out the way you want. Any questions about course stuff before we get going? Okay. All right. So this week I want to talk about fingerprinting. It's a little bit different from some of the other stuff we've been talking about. The fingerprinting is the idea of identifying a particular piece of music, piece of recording, an audio waveform against a database. For a long time, I wasn't that interested in this stuff because it seemed like it was this kind of trick that doesn't work the way that a lot of the other stuff we're trying to do works. In particular, the fingerprinting schemes are sort of not at all perceptually based, right? The way a fingerprinter works is not how you can recognize a particular piece of music, and so in that way, it sort of seemed less attractive to me. But on the other hand, it's extremely powerful, and it does raise a number of interesting applications. It makes possible a number of applications which you can't do by other means. And whenever there's something that's really, really powerful, it's always worth investigating because, you know, it opens up this space of possibilities. So I've gotten very interested in it recently. And we've done a bunch of sort of derivative projects using these approaches. So I'll talk about try and define the problem in general and give you a sense of what's special about it. And I'll talk about a couple of approaches. The earlier approaches were using frame-based analysis, the sort of typical audio analysis we've been looking at. And then the more recent approaches use these landmark-based techniques, which don't have fixed analysis frames, or maybe not on the surface, and work a little bit better, work kind of very nicely. Yeah. All right. So in fingerprinting, it's search, but it's a known item search. You've got a query, and you're trying to find an exact instance of that query in your database. Or see if you can find it, or see if it's present. And so the original iPhone app that does this is the Shazam app, which allows you to hold up your phone in a place where music is playing in the background, and very often it will be able to identify what that piece of music is, which is kind of an amazing thing. And it can, and it's got a database. I don't know how big it is, but it's millions of tracks, and it only needs a few seconds from anywhere in any of those tracks to find. So it's searching. It's got a database of hundreds of millions of seconds of audio, and it's able to find a match within a few seconds, probably a fraction of a second. How can it even do that? Well, hundreds of millions of seconds of audio is a lot of audio, but each second of audio It's got a lot of dimensions, right? It's got a lot of samples, whatever, 44,000 samples maybe. And so if you think of those as a 44,000 dimensional space, suddenly you can fit a lot of different points in there. So it's not, every second of every track is probably unique, or at least there aren't going to be very many cases where you can take 1 second out of one piece of arbitrary audio and find it in another track. So it is possible, as long as it really is the exact same second of waveform that you're looking at. So that's the key thing, that the audio fingerprinting relies on it starting off with, at least, whatever was playing over the speakers was that exact recording, that exact release of the piece of music that it's going to match. And so something which could sound exactly the same, like say the band played it twice when they did a recording session, and it sort of sounds exactly the same, but there are slight differences in the performance. They won't match at all because, those slight differences, the millisecond difference where the guitarist hit the string are going to make differences in the waveforms and make actually distinct versions that this kind of fingerprinting could tell apart, even if a listener couldn't possibly tell them apart. The real problems are that you want to be able to do this match even though in the Shazam case, you don't know what the environment's going to be, you don't know what the speakers are like, you don't really know what the microphone's like, and there may be background noise as well that you want to be robust to. And the reasons we want to do this, it's kind of, this sort of seems like a not very important thing, that you're in a coffee shop and you want to know what's playing on the radio, but it's very compelling, that people really like that. People are very impressed by it, and it is something you want to know. It's not completely, it is a real dilemma we face. There are more sort of pragmatic applications. Because of the way that musicians are paid, there's an important industry of keeping track of what music is played on the radio. That a commercial radio station or a radio station, every time it plays the music, it's supposed to pay a license fee to the guy whose music they're playing. And so there are companies whose job it is to make sure that every time that someone's music is played, it's recorded, it's noted. Another interesting application is this idea of correctly assigning metadata to recordings. So, because of the history of how digital music has come about, there are a lot of files out there, a lot of different versions of any given music file, and the metadata, the artist name, etc., that may be embedded in the file is kind of unreliable. It may have come from different sources, may contain typos or whatever. And so there's this nice idea, well, we don't really need to look at the actual file to figure out what piece of music this is. We can just run the fingerprint, look it up on some server, get some canonical version of the metadata, and resolve it like that. Another thing that we've done is, in the music IR community, there's a lot of work on, a lot of people do research on particular sets of music, like the Beatles is a very popular corpus. But because of copyright restrictions, we can't share our particular versions, our particular rips of the Beatles CD. So everyone has to rip their own versions of the CDs and then hope they're using the same data, which they're not using exactly the same data. I mentioned before, the chord labels you're using come from these guys at Queen Mary who spent a long time going through manually labeling their audio. They released the data because they generated the data, but they couldn't release the audio. So our audio didn't quite align, but we can use fingerprinting to figure out exactly what the alignment is. Yeah?
Wouldn't the just digital publication of their entire corpus possibly standardize that data set?
Yeah, well, you'd hope. I assume so. But maybe you don't want to go out and buy it again if you've already... Yeah, so this again, historical situation where there were, for the Beatles, there are probably at least 8 different digital masterings of their CDs, right? Different times, different transfers. And then every time, if you rip a CD, there's no real hard standard for what file you get. It's not like the CD is a file system. It's more like a continuous thing. So when you rip a CD, you get particularly different. You should be It should be pretty much sample for sample, but you get different amounts of silence at the beginning. So there are... I did this thing, I did this analysis where there was this website called morecowbell.dj that was run by the Echo Nest, and you could upload files and it would add cowbell on the beat, which was just, kind of just showing off their analysis techniques. I got some of the data from that. I got, I think, 100,000 tracks, 100,000 files that had been uploaded or something like that. And then I tried to figure out what the tracks were. I was playing this fingerprinting stuff. And there were like 440. So there were of 100,000 tracks. I can't remember what the number was. Some large proportion, like 20% of them, were the "Don't Fear the Reaper," which is what the joke about More Cowbell is about, because it's a track with a lot of cowbell on it. And then there were over 400 different MP3s, different versions of that track, which had just been ripped from different CDs or ripped differently or encoded differently, but they were just like, it's one track, but there were hundreds of different versions out there, just because of all the different ways you can generate a different file. So yeah, in theory, now if you wanted to get a reference version for the Beatles, you'd go to the iTunes store and buy their canonical version. But if you're dealing with the real world, there are a lot of versions out there, even of stuff that isn't particularly diverse. And it's sort of, I guess, that's kind of it's nice to go with the intrinsic information, right? Rather than having to sort of rely on anything else. Just say, what is true about, what is the real content of this music? It's this audio, and even though there are differences in encoding, I can still identify that it's that particular audio. That's a useful thing to be able to do. Okay, so let's start with a very, very simple scheme, just to get an idea of how we might do this. So the point of a fingerprint is it's some description of a piece of media in general. Fingerprint coming from fingers is what the FBI store in their fingerprint database is a relatively compact description of certain, I forget what the name is, but places where two of your lines on your fingerprint join, and so that allows them to mostly uniquely identify a fingerprint, but to do it with a reasonable amount of relatively small record. So in audio and other media fingerprinting, the idea is we've got enough data to uniquely identify a particular example, but it's a compact record. It's a small amount of data that we actually have to store rather than the whole thing. We could just store the whole thing and compare it, sample for sample every time, but that would be very expensive to search and very expensive to keep because it would be a large database. So let's say we've got these 1 second chunks of audio, but there's only a certain number of them that exist in the world, and that's our domain that we're searching across. What we could do is just choose 2 times within that 1 second window and just store the actual waveform value at those 2 instances. So maybe this is sampled at 44,000 samples per second. We've got 44,000 samples for each one of these chunks of audio. We're just going to store 2 of those samples from a particular point. And then you could imagine taking those 2 values and plotting them on a 2-dimensional graph, which will give you exactly 1 point for each of these waveforms. And now we've taken the waveforms, we've reduced them to this compact record, and if someone gave us an unlabeled waveform, which we believed was one of these, we could do the same thing, plot it on here, and then see which of these points it was closest to. If it was exactly the same waveform, it would fall on one of the points. Even if there were problems like, a certain amount of low-level noise had been added to the waveform, that would just be a small deviation around one of these points, so we'd still be able to hopefully find it. We'd make errors in the case where the noise in our signal was larger than the spacing between adjacent points, which is obviously a function of the noise level and of the density in this projected feature space of the particular signals. We also, of course, have the problem with this particular scheme that we have to know exactly where the waveforms begin. If we're offset in time, which is not that unusual in audio, then the whole thing falls apart. But, depending on the constraints of the problem, you can... The point I'm trying to make here is that often you can do almost anything, and because you're working on this assumption that the waveform is exactly the same, or somehow the derived features should be exactly the same, then almost any function of those derived features ought to be conserved, right? It'll be the same if you have the same input. The only question is, are we sure it's going to be different for a different input? And we can always do that by increasing the number of dimensions, right? So this is 2 dimensions, but if we had 3 or 4, then the chances of a random collision would get smaller. And is it going to be robust to any changes that we encounter? Yeah?
So are these waveforms in like different sections of the same song that would be different sounds?
The idea, the analogy here is that they would be different songs, right? It's not a, I mean, the time origin problem is a huge problem for the song type problem here, right? We couldn't do this for Shazam because we don't know where we started.
I guess I'm confused because they're different songs. How do you choose like what section of the song you want to?
You just, I mean, okay. This is a straw man. But it's just like to say what we could do. But we just say, okay, I'm going to take the value at 10 seconds and the value at 30 seconds, and that's it. Or the value of 10, 20, and 30 seconds. You can think about having this as this 2-dimensional plot, or you could think about trying to condense every point on the surface into a single value, which can be useful, because here, rather than having to just look in this plot and try and find the nearest neighbor, we could chop everything up into bins, little rectangular regions, and then just see which one it fell into. Let's give each region a particular label, and then we just have to choose the bin, and then we know the answer. That's basically what a hash function does. A hash function takes some amount of data, like the number of coordinates in a high-dimensional space, and reduces them to a single index in a linear array of buckets, and then you can put whatever you want into that bucket, and you could find something. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but that's the thing that allows us to solve these problems very fast, because then when we've got a query, we just do the hash, look at that point in the hash table, and we get the answer in constant time. Okay, so the interesting problem that was solved by the Shazam approach and most of the fingerprinting literature, what it deals with, is this problem with channel, in particular the idea of being able to recognize audio even if it's played over a speaker and recorded with another microphone, which is they're all part of the channel, right? They're all the signal that the channel signal is going through, but they're just different aspects of it, and in the presence of added noise. So you might have a recording like this, which I think, that's actually synthetic, but that's the kind of thing that you would expect. Like you're in some coffee shop, there's music playing, you make a recording, it's like that. When we listen to it, we can hear some music in the background, but there's obviously a lot of other stuff going on, and the quality's not that good. So I think this is the original audio spectrogram, and this is that recording that we just heard, and we see there's almost no energy above 4 kilohertz, it's been filtered out. There's a lot of added energy around here that's sort of, corrupting the signal, and then it's just not very distinct. So how do we come up with representations which can recognize that those two things are equivalent? We have this time reference problem that we don't know where in the track, in the song this particular sample came from. It's just randomly plucked from the middle of some track. And we'd like to be able to match on the shortest possible amount. Clearly, if we have a very short amount, it's going to become more ambiguous. So the longer the sample is, the more likely we are to get the right response. But we don't want to have to use like a minute's worth of audio to do the match. And for this particular kind of application, we're trying to match commercially released popular music. There's a lot of it. We need a very large corpus in order to have low out of a low incidence of cases where we're querying for something which we don't know what it is. So we have to worry about efficiency to do this. And then the essential trade-off in a task like this is a detection task. Can we detect, the presence of a particular known item in this noise? The trade-off is between false alarm and false reject. If we are too lax in our matching criteria, if we allow a very large noise radius, if you like, then we may detect the presence of something in here when there really isn't something there, or we may detect the wrong thing. That's more likely the risk. But if we're too narrow, if we only allow matches that are spot on, then we have false reject problems. That even though the track is there, we're going to say we don't believe it's there when it really is. So you obviously have a single kind of trade-off that you want to you don't want to reject stuff, but you don't want to start giving the wrong answers. Okay, so the most natural approach to this is to take our standard frame-based analysis and try and calculate features based on audio frames. So I'm calling this the frame-based approach, and the idea is you chop up the audio into little short-time frames. Each one of those frames gives you a feature vector, and then you have a sequence of frames giving a sequence of feature vectors, and you try and match based on that. You get that from your query, and you try and find the same sequence or a matching sequence of feature vectors in your reference database. So we've got this large database, which is formed by taking a library of reference items, analyzing each of those, and framing them up. And then with a query, we do the same thing and just try and quickly find amongst this large collection the matching frames. If this is going to work, we're going to have to make sure the features are robust to the changes in channel we've just spoken about. We've got some framing in here, right, which is like, well, we're going to take every 25 milliseconds in the audio. If we delayed the reference item by 12.5 milliseconds, each of those frames would have fallen on a slightly different part of the audio. Because in the query we don't know whether it's starting, we want to make sure that that is not an issue, that the features aren't particularly sensitive to the exact place where the frames fall. I'm calling that timing skew. And then obviously we need to worry about the efficiency of doing the search, that if there's a very large database, we certainly can't afford to do a linear search to go through and check every frame. So the biggest problem is channel immunity. I mean, as we heard, the signal can sound very, very different if it's been recorded through a speaker. Other things that can happen, other less severe things that you might also have to deal with are lossy encoding. So you have the original audio, but then you encode it with MP3, which introduces some distortion, changes the waveform pretty significantly. It's adding noise at maybe 15 dB below the main signal. You could also have things like dynamic range compression. These are things that are commonly done to signals when they're broadcast on the radio to sort of, make the quiet bits a bit louder so that you don't have to have such a big, you don't have to worry about the noise floor in your broadcast or your recording. And then other ways that noise can be added. So one of the earliest schemes that was published for dealing with this kind of audio is this paper by Heitzner and Kalka. They did a series of papers about it in 2002, 2003. And what they did was they would take a spectrogram of some kind. I guess they took an auditory spectrogram, but it doesn't necessarily matter. They zoom in so you can see the individual pixels. You can't see them very clearly here, but they're individual time frequency cells with a particular magnitude. And then, so they get this X of TF, which is some real valued energy at each time frequency cell. And then they convert that into a binary feature, which is 1 if XTF plus XT plus 1F plus 1 is greater than X tf plus 1 plus xt plus 1f plus 1. So they're sort of taking a set of 4 points, summing the two diagonals, and then seeing which of those is larger. And so because they're diagonal and because they're sort of symmetric, on average, you're going to get, on average, they're going to be about the same. So this bit mask is going to have a nice distribution where about 50% of the B's are 1 and 50% are 0. But the particular pattern of whether it's 1 or 0 will depend on the local structure of this magnitude spectrogram. And so you end up with the audio being represented by this kind of very dense pattern of ones and zeros, one for every time frequency cell, but that correctly reflects the local structure of the audio. Because it's very local in time and very local in frequency, and because it's relative energy, this is pretty nicely, has a bunch of immunities. If you scale the audio, it doesn't make any difference. They're all going to be scaled by the same amount. Even if you put it through a filter, right, a gain that varies with frequency, as long as the gain doesn't vary too rapidly between two adjacent frequency bands, so they're both going to be scaled by about the same amount, then most of the time this won't change. And the same with time. You can have time gain that varies with time, which is what dynamic compressor does. And again, as long as it doesn't change between t and t plus 1, then these values aren't going to change. If you add noise, as long as the noise you add doesn't, if you add approximately the same noise energy to each of these cells, then they'll still stay the same. And as long as the noise energy doesn't shift the balance between which of these pairs is larger, then the binarization will still be the same. So it's only in the case where where these two things happen to be almost the same, and the noise energy is just enough, the difference in the noise energy between each pair is enough to change the relative ordering of them, that's the only time that the noise is going to hurt. And so, above some noise level, it's the mask is the bit mask is going to reflect the noise and not the signal. But you've got a pretty good shot that as long as the signal is locally louder than the noise, it's probably going to stay the same. So now we've got the track represented like this, and we assume that what we're going to get is a query which we hope is going to give us the same little hash. Now, if we can find a chunk of query that matches, then we're in good shape. We still have the issue of timing skew, right? That XTF spectrogram started with some particular sample, and if we shift it over by half a window and redo it, and we get a whole different thing, then it might not work at all. So the way, the normal kind of model for short time analysis is you take a window, you calculate the analysis in that window, then maybe you overlap, you advance by half a window's length, calculate the next window, and then half a window length. This is the overlap add kind of thing. So there is some overlap between successive windows, but it's only 50%. If you then had a query which was maximally displaced from that, so it was displaced by like a quarter of a window here, then for this first query window here, it's not all that good a match to 1. It's not all that good a match to 2. And so you might get something where you got relatively few matching hash bits. If, however, you use a much smaller increment relative to your window size, or equivalently a much longer window size for the same increment, the same hop between successive windows, then now the difference between frame 1 of the query and the nearest frames of the reference, frames 1 and 2, well, it's still offset by half a hop size, but that's only like 1/16 of the entire thing. So query frame 1 is pretty similar to reference frame 1 because they're 90% the same. Of course, the corollary of that is that reference frame 2 is also pretty similar to reference frame 1 because they're 80% the same. And so you end up with reference descriptions that are very smooth in time, that vary rather slowly in time. But you now don't have to worry about the timing skew, the actual exact frame alignment in your analysis, which would otherwise be a problem. Okay, so now we've got this representation, and now I want to do the matching. And so here's a little example from the Heitzman and Kolka paper. Here's their bit mask analysis of a particular chunk of the original audio, and it's 32 bits by, in this case, 256 time frames. And you can see it's quite smooth, right? Each bit tends not to change in successive time frames because of this long window effect. Here's the original. Here is the analysis of an MP3 that's been encoded at 128 kbits, so it's got a lot of quantization artifacts in it. But here's the difference between these two. So this is white when these two have the same value, and black when they have a different value. So it's the XOR of these two. And we see that, yeah, they're not identical, but the large majority of the bits are the same. And that this is clearly a good match. Whereas if they were random, we'd expect this to be, just a random bit mask if they were unrelated. So in their scheme, this was their unit of matching, 256 frames with 32 channels. They were using 11.6 millisecond frames, so it's actually 3 seconds of audio. So if you have like 10,000 tracks of 200 seconds each, that's about 200 million frames. If I give you one of these chunks and you've got this, 10,000 tracks is not a very big database, right? It's kind of, you can cover a lot, but you'd easily find things that weren't in it. But to have to sort of do this calculation of calculating this XOR, this Hamming distance for all of your 200 million offsets within a database, that would be expensive. It probably only takes seconds, but it would take seconds, and so that's not really acceptable. Particularly if you want to actually scale this up to 10 million, and then it suddenly starts taking a lot more seconds. So what they did was they would say, okay, well, here's each one of these 256 columns is a particular 32-bit word, which is a large space of words, right? It gives us a lot of gives us 4 billion different possibilities. And so what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to take one of these words out of 256. I'm going to look for all the places in the database where there's an exact match, where that 32-bit word occurred elsewhere. And then I'm going to calculate the Hamming score for all the frames around that particular region. Now, because we do expect some number of bit errors, in most cases, if I take one exact 32-bit word here and then look for somewhere else where it occurred in the database, it won't be this. It won't actually have occurred the same. So this particular word here from this MP3 encoded version, because there's a single bit error here, it's not the same as 32-bit word in this one, and so I wouldn't actually find this. But if I do this for all 256, then somewhere in here there's a column that's entirely white, where it just happens that none of the bits, there were no errors in any of the bits for one 32-bit word. In that case, when I do my hash into the database to find all the places where that 32-bit word occurred, I will get the right hash here, because that turns out that this word is the same as this word. And then I may get multiple of those, right? For a 32-bit word, if just a single frame of audio may have occurred in multiple different tracks. But then I search across the neighborhood of the nearest 256 frames, calculate this full bit mask, and then, okay, there's only one case where this one frame matched exactly, and all the surrounding frames matched very close, had few Hamming bit errors. And so rather than having to search over 200 million frames, I'm searching over, 200 million divided by 4 billion or something, which in this case is smaller than 1. So I'd be lucky if I got even one hit. But in general, I could do that very efficiently. The problem here is, well, maybe, if we're unlucky, it wouldn't be impossible to imagine that none of these columns had 0 spots in them. So that's, we can even try and deal with that. We can say, okay, I've got this single 32-bit word, and I can find any instances of that in the entire database. But let's say, well, maybe I've got 1 bit error in this. Well, there are only 32 additional words which are 1 bit away from this one. So I can then run 32 further queries where I assume each one of my bits was wrong, and then see if I get any hits there, and I can see what happens there. And if we were trying to work even harder, we could take 32 times 31 words which are 2 bits away from the particular word we're looking at. And all we're doing is we're generating these candidate chunks from within the reference database. And for every candidate, we can then calculate this full 32 by 256 bit error matrix. And then when we get the right one, the chances of seeing something with only a few errors here is very, very small, right? The chances that it's going to look the same over all this 3-second window is kind of vanishingly small. And so as long as we have some way of knowing where to look within our very large database, then we can once we find it, we can be sure we've got it. It's possible to do a rather more formal analysis of this. I mean, that was kind of like the numbers there are so large that you can sort of see that it's going to work. That if we really do only look at each instance of a 32-bit word, then we don't expect there to be very many of those, and the chances of having multiple chance matches like that seems very small. But here's a quick sort of sketch of the kind of how you can do this mathematically. We can define A as the probability that a particular frame has the right hash if it's the right audio. And this is not, if there was no noise, then it would be 1. If there were no noise, no framing errors, etc., it would be 1. But in general, it's not, it's not going to be 1. We're interested in these problems where there is some distortion. But it's going to be significant. Let's say it's 0.5. So for a particular frame of the correct audio, we've got a 50% chance that the 32-bit word will match correctly. We can define B as the probability of getting that same hash for a completely unrelated frame of audio, which is basically the chance of choosing one of these 32-bit words at random and having it be the right one. Of course, it's not 0, but it is quite small. It's 1 and 2 to 32. What about the chances of having one of these hashes be one of the 1-bit differences that we were also talking about? That's a little larger. There are 32 of those plus the original, so 33 out of 2 to 32 of those words, which are 0 or 1 bits different from the correct one. But that's still pretty small. It's about 10 to the minus 8, 1 in 100 million. So if we have L frames to search through, right, so we've got a database of L frames, what is the chance that we're going to have, just at random, we're going to have an instance of this particular frame, a particular hash, in that database? Well, that's the 1 minus the chance that we'll have 0 incorrect hashes in that database. So this is the chance of getting a wrong hash. So the chance of not getting a wrong hash is 1 minus that. And the chance of doing that L times over is that to the power L. So the chance of getting at least one incorrect match in our L frame database is that, which means that if we have 200 million frames, like we were talking about, the probability that our 32-bit hash occurs somewhere in there for the wrong audio is 0.78. I mean, just for these example numbers. The point is that you can be pretty sure that once your database gets big enough, you can be pretty sure that any particular 32-bit value will be in there somewhere, right? So you can't just assume that if you get a single hit, you're okay. But that's not what we're doing. We're assuming we're going to look at multiple frames, and then we're going to require let's say, all of those to match. So if we say, well, we're going to take 8 successive frames, and we want them all to match, the chances of them all matching, if it's the right audio, is now 0.5 to the 8, which is now 1 in 256. So because each frame has only a coin flip chance of being right, the chance of 8 frames in a row being right is now getting pretty small. That's not much use. If we have a 0.5% chance, a 0.4% chance of actually getting the right answer. But the chances they're all going to match, given that it's the wrong audio, is also this thing to the k. Wait, not this thing to the k. The chance of one of them being wrong to the k. And now this is tiny. This is 10 to the minus 65. So even if we scale it up, it's never going to become a significant probability. So we've got a nice ratio between the chances of a correct accept and the chances of a false accept. It's now whatever, 10 to the minus 62 is the ratio. The only problem is that the chances of a correct accept are pretty small. So if we can boost up both of these, then we can be all right. The way we can do that is saying, well, rather than requiring 8 successive hashes to be correct, we can say we're going to take some larger number of comparison points, say 16, and then we're just going to say, we're going to count how many of those match. And if at least some number of them, say 8, match, then we'll accept. And basically what this does is, rather than having a single go at this matching 8 frames, we have basically n choose k, 16 choose 8 attempts at doing this. And then these things sort of add up. So we're sort of scaling both of these probabilities by n choose 8, which probabilities don't exactly work like that. But in this case, for choosing 8 out of 16, that gives us like 10,000 attempts at doing this. Now the probability of a false reject here, the chances that we're going to actually, that fewer than 8 of the 16 matches will be correct, given that the chance of each one is 0.5, suddenly this becomes vanishingly small, becomes 10 to the minus 22. Our probability of false accept becomes 1 minus 10 to the minus 22. But the probability of a false accept here also gets scaled up, but it's 10 to the minus 65. So even when you scale it up by 10 to the 22, it's still 10 to the minus 40. It's not something we have to worry about. So it's a little, I don't feel like that was that easy to follow, but you get the idea that you use these kind of probabilistic things. When you require multiple trials, the probabilities sort of multiply out. And so if you have a particular ratio, you can make that ratio much, much larger between a true accept and a false accept. And then because the numerator of that ratio is getting quite small, you can use these combinatoric things to try multiple things to sort of scale them both up, but you're scaling them both up by a constant. And so the ratio stays the same. And so you can get the numerator to be a sensible number and still have a high ratio between the probability of a correct accept and the probability of false accept. That's the general shape of these things. Okay, so actually I have to leave. I didn't mention this before, but I have to leave early today because I have to go to this Dean's meeting. But let me just quickly tell you about the landmark approach, and then Keen-Sub can show you some of the stuff for the practical. So this is the scheme that's used in Shazam, and it was developed by Avery Wang, and he's published a couple of papers on it. And the idea is, rather than using the just some arbitrary time window, the normal sort of short time analysis thing, as the way of figuring out which bit of audio you're going to use, you actually use the signal itself. You try and find some kind of structure within that, and use the time reference relative to the structure you can observe in the audio. And then it doesn't matter where you start in the audio, because as long as after a while, you're going to find these reference points at the same point. And so you automatically deal with the synchronization or this time skew problem. So that was one very clever idea. Another idea was this using in the Kalker and Heitzmer hash, they were calculating the bits based on the local structure, but they were doing it for every little time frequency region. So what Avery thought was, well, why not just focus on a few specific regions, calculate the hashes based on some spectrally local structure, But each hash only depends on a certain range of frequencies. And so if we have a situation where maybe a frequency band is entirely deleted, as long as we've got some hashes which are based on other frequency bands, we'll be okay. If we had the situation where a signal had just been put through some high-pass filter, so there was nothing below 500 hertz, every one of those 32-bit hashes for the Calca scheme would have just random bits for the bottom part, and so they'd all be wrong. And you'd have to be very lucky to get one of your 32-bit frames to match. But the Shazam thing has fingerprints which are based on different frequency regions, so as long as one of the frequency regions is preserved, you're still going to get some hashes matching. So the particular idea is doing a time frequency analysis and looking for peaks in the time frequency plane and using those as the basis of your hashes. Now the nice thing is that so these are the onsets typically in the signal, and so they have the highest energy. By definition, you're looking for the ones with the highest energy, which means that they're also the ones which have the greatest signal-to-noise ratio, right? They're the ones with the highest signal. If the noise is uniformly spread everywhere, then they're also going to be the ones that are least affected by added noise. So that's a lot of things which make this work very well. So the starting point is you take a spectrogram and you try and find these points where the energy gets locally much larger. So here, this is actually a telephone ring, but it gives you the idea. And so here, where there are particular beginnings of energy regions, that's where you choose your landmarks, these time frequency landmarks. Now, you could just say, well, I'm going to just take each one of these and then do that as the basis of my database search. But there aren't that many different frequencies. You can say which frequency it is, but there might only be 256 frequencies, something like that, in a spectrogram. That doesn't give you the 2 to the 32 different buckets that you can use for your hashing. So what they did was they said, okay, we'll take a pair of these. We'll take two successive or two nearby frequency peaks. And what we'll use as our sort of hash key is the features of this particular pair. And so in particular, we'll take the start frequency, the end frequency, and the time difference between them. And then that will hopefully be preserved in a different version of the signal. It'll still have, because the signal is sort of the same over this chunk, it'll have the same two different frequency features occurring, the same time distance apart. But now, if I quantize the frequencies at 256, and if I say quantize the time difference with, into 64 bins, I'm suddenly getting a much larger space of hashes. So in this case, it would be like 4 million distinct hashes. And now I've got my buckets, and now I'm dividing every frame, every instance of a landmark, distributing these tracks amongst these 4 million buckets. So now I can just take one of these and then find the 1/4,000,000th of my data set that happens to occur with those. And I've got a much smaller space that I have to do a more detailed search across. What they actually do is you'll build a hash table which takes one of these and then returns to you all the track IDs that contain it and all the time offsets. And then you can build a number of these hashes, right? So you don't just take the single pair, but you take all these other ones, and then you do it for all the other points. So you get dozens and dozens of hashes. You look up in the hash table for each of those, and you get a list of all the tracks that contain any of these hashes, but then you'll find there's a certain track that has lots of them, and you can even check the time offsets to check they all line up correctly, and you can quickly be pretty sure that you're looking at the right hash. How to find these little peaks, basically you just have some kind of decaying threshold, so that once you see an onset energy, you then say, well, I'm not going to, the energy is going to have to go above this threshold before I pick it again. So this sort of image here, which is showing these kind of decaying onset energies, and then the red dots show when the energy peaks above. But it's quite easy to control. And then you end up with a representation of the signal like this. So this is the actual query audio we heard before. Is that going to play now? So each of the circles, each circle is one of these local peaks that have been pulled out by the decaying threshold. You can see they're very sparse. This is a 5-second example, and we're only getting a few a second at different frequency bands. And each line is one of these pairs of nearby hashes which are being connected and stored in the database. And so we have a few dozen of those for this little chunk of audio. That's from the query. Here's the reference item. We've got the same thing drawn, but the green ones are the ones that match between the query and the reference. So here's the reference. So it's the same audio. Now, it was only a few of these. It was only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these that matched. But the chances of 6 of these pairs of landmarks occurring in some random reference item is very, very small, right? You'd have to have this exact configuration of landmarks. And so that, even with a small number like that, you can get a reliable match, something like that. The interesting thing, of course, is that you're assuming that didn't happen elsewhere in the database. But, of course, there are many, many signals which will give the same pattern of landmarks. So here, what I've done is I've taken each of the landmarks from the particular part of the reference item, and I've just put a little sinusoidal blip down there, so we get something that sounds like this, which doesn't sound anything like the audio to us. But because that's just enough to trigger the fingerprint in all the right places, it does indeed match the database in the same place. Yeah?
Is it possible to spoof or trick Shazam by playing another track that's completely different but generates a similar signature so that it fools it?
Yeah. So that's what this is trying to do. I tried this on Shazam. It doesn't actually work because I don't know exactly where the landmarks are being constructed. But in principle, if you had something which knew exactly how to which landmarks were going to get pulled from the original, you could do this little blips, and it would work. I should figure out how to do that sometime. But the reason that it's not a problem is because, in theory, that's possible. But the chances of that happening accidentally, right? They're just having little energy at these little spots. It's just at the right time. It never happens.
It's not necessarily what's going on because it's about to the audio, so you have multiple audio signals that don't have to.
Exactly. I could have filled these white areas in with anything, as long as it was low enough in energy that it didn't disrupt the formation, these things being the peaks, and it would still have given me exactly the same hash analysis. So you can do the same kind of error analysis for the Shazam features. It's the same kinds of things with A's and B's. You can plot these as a function of the number of matching hashes that you require. And so if we only require a couple of matching hashes, then we're very likely to get the right thing matching, but there's a pretty high false alarm rate. But as the number of matching hashes goes up, the false alarm rate falls very, very fast. And the probability of an incorrect hash, even if we only assume that the hashes are going to be conserved at 1 in 10, that falls much more gently. And so we can get these very, very robust, very, very low false alarm rates, which is what we observe, right? The Shazam app almost never gives you the wrong answer. I don't know if I've ever seen it do it. Sometimes it can't give you any answer, but it doesn't give you the wrong answer. Okay, so that's fingerprinting. So I'm going to hand over to Björn now, and then on Wednesday we're going to we have a little implementation of this that we can I'm sorry I have to leave, but my boss's boss said I had to.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is to show you the code that we will use for Wednesday's practical, and give you some idea what we're gonna do. Okay. So the fingerprinting practical that we will do Wednesday is based on this code, and it's basically implementing the Shazam approach, the fingerprinting approach, the one that Dan just talked about for the last thing. And here, what we are going to do here first is calculate the fingerprint for one song, which is this Beatles Taxman, and it sounds like this.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Let me tell you how.
Anyway, so this find landmarks finds the landmark of this entire song, and the song is about 2.5 minutes, and from there we get the landmark of this length, and this depends on the length of the input that you put in the find landmark, and this is the tuple that we get for each time frame. So let's see. So these are aligned, sorted by the starting time. So the first column corresponds to the starting time of each landmark. And then this one here, 7, is the starting frequency, bin. So it's from actually 0 to 255. I'm not 100% sure if it's 1 to 256 or 0 to 255, but anyway, that's about it. And this is the ending of it. And here is the time difference between these landmarks. So something like here, and the time difference. So then what we can try is display the landmark in the I think oops, is it true? Yeah, I think it is. Okay, so the reason that this one looks so messy is it's so the signal that we entered is so long, right? So we want to look at a part of it, then we just use this to see first 20 seconds of this result, right? So we can scroll it to see more of it. So yeah, these are the landmark that we got. So now what we can do is try to form the hash function out of this landmarks. So remember that we can form hash here 256 by 256 by 64 means 4 mega distinct patterns that can be hashed from these landmarks, right? So that's what we do. So the result is, this is just song ID, and this is the hash, and I think this is the number of times it's been shown. So and then okay, so here so far we've just done with one song, and now we have these data files that is pre-generated using the RS20 database, which has 13 songs. So it's pretty reasonable, large size data set. And also there are 3 different kinds of data depending on how much accuracy or how much memory space do you want to use. So we'll go with this example. So now we've loaded this hash table and hash table count, which is this data. And what we're going to do with this is, okay, so we generated the hash out of this taxman song, right? And let's see what we get for taxman out of this hash table. So there are some hits, right? And then to see the names of the matches. Here, Aerosmith. So in the third one, we have this taxman, right? And with different landmark, we get also the taxman. So it shows, it's just with one hash function. So we're not using even K hash to generate the match. So what we can try then is try to see how powerful this method is. The way we try here is, okay, so get random queries is getting some excerpt of each songs we input here. So here we are inputting so we have 13 songs in the data set. So we just input 100, 200 until 1400 songs as an input, and then we will see what we get. So here, these Q values are just the excerpt of each sample. So it should contain, because I'm inputting here like 4 seconds of data. Okay. Yeah. So the parameter here, this 4 is what's the duration of the excerpt that you want to get from these songs. I inputted 4, which means that I want a 4-second excerpt. And here, 0 means I don't want any noise to be added. So on Wednesday, you can experiment with this noise. So to see how robust this method is against additive noise, random noise, actually. Yeah. And then, and here, what we get is, so Q is, let me show you what Q looks like. Q, just 1. There are 14 of Q. 64 divided by SR is 4. So this means that we get 4 seconds of data from the excerpt, right? And then these landmarks are generated for each 14 samples, and then we generated hashes from that. And then what we get using eval print, fprint is, so here these are results, the R contains the result of the matching, and the first column is the song number, which sounds like, looks like pretty good because we inputted 100 to 1400 and we're getting mostly them, but this one is not good, right? But what we show in the second, third, and fourth column are the total number of matches. And then this is, what we are storing is also hashes and time, starting time of that landmark. So this is the difference between the starting time of the matches and that is most common, and this is the just I think it's hash value. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, so what we can look at here is there are 15 matches, and 8 of them have the same like time difference, which means that this is pretty strong match, and we get the correct answer. And here, 20 out of 26, 9, and out of 12, 11 has the same starting time, which is pretty, strong. Oh, I think this is the time difference. So remember that we excerpted the sample randomly, right? So these are just time difference, when we excerpt it, right? So if we, let's see, for this one, this corresponds to 0.64 time. So the excerpt that we got is from 0.64 seconds to 4.64 seconds. Yeah, which can be translated into. But anyway, so for this one, the number of matches are so low, so we can expect that this can be some. This could be wrong, and yeah, I think that's pretty much all the main functions. So this is just to hear. This is matching result, displaying the matching result. So so this is the first song that we queried, and the resulting match is the same song, and the landmarks are somewhat different, but because of the time skew, I think. Look at here and here, it's a little bit, the time is a little bit not matching, but some of the landmark is matching, so it was selected. Okay, and we can listen to the sound. The first one and second one is almost the same, except the starting point, right? As we've seen here. Here at the start there is some frequency component in all frequencies, but here there's none, and it's like a point, a little bit, not aligned. Anyway, this is all. Any questions so far? Okay, then we'll play around it on Wednesday. This is it. Thank you. Bye.
Do you think that, so me and Riddy are working on the mini project 3, but I don't know.
Just a second, please.
Okay.